I can't stand taking care of this old woman. I heard my daughter-in-law say, her voice a low, venomous hiss that sliced through the thin wall between the kitchen and my reading nook. The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering as shards of broken glass. My teacup trembled in my hand, the porcelain rattling against the saucer in a tiny earthquake of shock and hurt. My heart, a tired old muscle that had faithfully pumped for 82 years, gave a painful, violent lurch. That old woman. She meant me, Eleanor. A wife, a mother, a grandmother, a life filled with laughter and tears, reduced to a 4-word burden. The floorboards above me in the master bedroom creaked as my son, Mark, paced. He was always pacing these days, forever caught in the gravitational pull between his wife and his mother. A man stretched so thin I was afraid he might one day simply evaporate into the tension that filled our home. "Brenda, please," he murmured, his voice a placating rumble, the sound of a man trying to smother a fire with a damp cloth. "For God's sake, keep your voice down. She can hear you." Brenda's response was a bitter, mirthless laugh that was more of a bark. Good. Maybe she should hear it. Maybe then she'd understand what a strain this is. "We have no life, Mark. We have no privacy. We're just caretakers in her museum. Her museum. My home. The house my late husband, Robert, and I had built with our own hands, every brick and beam a testament to a love that had spanned 50 years. Each rosebush in the garden, each worn spot on the hardwood floors, each crack in the ceiling held a memory. Now it was just a museum, and I was its dusty, inconvenient, and apparently despised relic. I squeezed my eyes shut, inhaling the familiar scent of lemon polish and old books, a fragrance that had always meant safety and comfort. But it did little to soothe the fresh, gaping wound that had been torn open in my chest. For months, I had felt it, the subtle shifts in the atmosphere, the cold drafts of resentment from Brenda that had nothing to do with the old windows. I saw it in the way her smiles never quite reached her eyes, turning her face into a polite, unsettling mask. I heard it in the heavy, put-upon sighs that followed me from room to room like a personal storm cloud. I had told myself I was imagining it, that grief and age had made me a sensitive old fool. But hearing the words spoken aloud, stripped of all pretense, confirmed my deepest, most secret fear. I wasn't family anymore. I was a job. A tiresome, thankless, and endless chore. And as I sat there, invisible in my own cherished home, a cold, hard resolve began to form in the hollow space where my heart used to be. Brenda was so focused on the burden of the relic, she had forgotten something important. She had forgotten whose name was on the deed to this museum, and I, its curator and queen, was going to have to remind her. Comment on which city you're watching from and subscribe to the channel because I guarantee there's more to this story than meets the eye. The days that followed were a quiet, simmering war fought in the trenches of our shared living space. Brenda's hostility was no longer a secret, but an open, albeit unspoken, declaration. My morning tea, which Mark used to bring me but Brenda had taken over, was now an instrument of passive aggression. It was no longer served in my favorite floral china cup, but in a thick, chipped mug. It was plonked on the side table, often lukewarm, sloshing over the side to form a sticky ring on the polished wood. Her conversations with me became clipped, transactional, a series of checkboxes on a caregiver's list. "Did you take your pills, Eleanor? Do you need anything from the store? Dinner is in 30 minutes. There was no, 'How are you feeling?' No, 'Did you sleep well?' The small kindnesses that oil the gears of a shared life had all dried up, leaving behind the grating sound of metal on metal. I started watching her, really watching her, with the keen, focused eye of a predator. I became a detective in my own home, cataloging every slight, every suspicious action, every crack in her carefully constructed facade. I began to notice things I hadn't before, things my grief and self-pity had previously obscured. She was always tired, the kind of soul-deep exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. Dark circles were etched like bruises beneath her eyes. She ate her meal standing up at the kitchen counter, shoveling food into her mouth as if she were late for a train. But where would she be going? Her life, as she'd so bitterly pointed out, was right here with me. She was a ghost in my house, haunting the kitchen and hallways, her face a constant mask of strained patience. One afternoon, I was arranging the photos on the mantelpiece, a habit of mine, a way of keeping Robert close, when I saw her through the large living room window. She was standing by the wilting rose bushes Robert had planted for our 25th anniversary, her cell phone pressed tightly to her ear. Her posture was tense, her back ramrod straight. She paced a small, frantic circle on the lawn, chewing on her lower lip. She kept glancing over her shoulder toward the house, toward my window, her eyes darting like a frightened bird. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the raw emotion on her face. A desperate, frantic pleading. She ended the call abruptly, jamming the phone into her pocket and swiping a hand across her face as if to wipe away tears or frustration, or both. When she came back inside, her expression was a shuttered mask of cold indifference. "Just a telemarketer," she said, her voice flat as she walked past me without meeting my eyes. I knew she was lying. The lie was as plain and ugly as the worn-out linoleum on the kitchen floor. It hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. Mark, my dear, sweet, willfully oblivious son, continued his futile attempts to be the peacemaker. "Mom, you have to understand, Brenda's under a lot of stress," he'd say in a hushed, conspiratorial tone when she was out of earshot. "Her job is demanding, and, well, looking after things here is a lot." Looking after me was a lot, is what he meant but didn't have the courage to say. He tiptoed around the truth, terrified of the explosion if Brenda and I ever collided head-on. He would buy me little gifts, a new mystery novel, a box of my favorite dark chocolate caramels, as if these small, pathetic offerings could patch the widening cracks in our family. But they couldn't. The foundation was crumbling, and no amount of chocolate could stop it. My suspicion grew, twisting into something dark and ugly inside me, a serpent coiling in my gut. I began to wonder if it was more than just resentment. Was she after the house? My savings? Robert, a careful and practical man, had left me well provided for. I wasn't a wealthy woman, but I was comfortable. The house was paid off, a prime piece of property in a neighborhood that was becoming more and more desirable with its old trees and proximity to the city. It was Mark's inheritance, of course, but not until I was gone. Was Brenda trying to hasten my departure, one cold cup of tea and one heavy sigh at a time? The thought was monstrous, a violation of everything I believed about family. I felt a pang of guilt for even thinking it, but it took root in the fertile soil of my fear and loneliness, growing like a stubborn, poisonous weed. I decided I needed proof. I couldn't go to Mark with just feelings and suspicions. I needed something concrete, something undeniable that would force him to finally see what his wife was really like. My mobility wasn't what it used to be, my arthritis a constant, nagging companion, but my mind was as sharp as it had ever been. I waited for a day when Brenda had to go into her office for a mandatory, all-day meeting. The house was quiet, filled only with the sonorous ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had always comforted me, a rhythmic heartbeat for our home. Now it seemed to be counting down to some unavoidable, catastrophic confrontation. My first target was their bedroom, a space I hadn't entered in years. It felt like a terrible violation, a betrayal of the trust that was already in tatters, but I pushed the feeling down with a cold resolve. I was a mother protecting her son, I told myself, a lioness protecting her cub from a viper. My hands shook as I turned the brass knob and pushed the door open. My breath caught in my throat as I opened her nightstand drawer. Inside, beneath a stack of lifestyle magazines, was a checkbook. Not their joint account, but one in her name only. Brenda C. Miller. My fingers, gnarled with age, trembled as I flipped through the register. There were checks written every single month for the past year. Large sums, $500 each, to a name I didn't recognize. Agnes Miller. Who is Agnes Miller? And why was Brenda sending her so much money? Money I knew they couldn't easily spare. Another detail, scribbled in the margins, caught my eye. There were frequent cash withdrawals, $100 here, $200 there, from an ATM near a place called Oakwood Nursing Facility, a drab, imposing building on the other side of town I'd passed once. A cold dread seeped into my bones, more chilling than any winter draft. Was she stashing money away? Was she planning to put me in a place like that? Building a nest egg to pay for my incarceration? The idea was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I sank onto the edge of their perfectly made bed, the checkbook register clutched in my hand like a death sentence. This was it. This was the proof. Brenda wasn't just resentful. She was plotting. She was siphoning off their money, Mark's money, and planning to get rid of me. The hurt I felt was overshadowed by a wave of pure, cold anger. The battle lines were drawn. I began to connect more dots, seeing her actions through this new, terrifying lens. The secretive phone calls were clearly about her scheme. The exhaustion wasn't from stress. It was from the strain of living a double life. A life that involved a mysterious Agnes Miller and a nursing home. And I was convinced that I was the obstacle she was trying to remove from her path. My days took on a new, grim purpose. I wasn't just a passive victim anymore. I was an investigator on the most important case of my life. I started listening at doors, my ear pressed against the cool wood, trying to decipher her hushed phone conversations. I made sure I was the first one to the mailbox, sorting through the bills and junk mail for any letters from Oakwood or Agnes Miller. I watched her every move. The tension in the house became thick enough to choke on. We circled each other like two wary animals, our polite words, "Good morning, sleep well?" barely concealing the growls beneath. Mark felt it, of course. His face was a mask of perpetual anxiety. He would look from my stony silence to her brittle smile, his expression pleading. "Can't we all just try to get along?" he'd ask, a foolishly simple question for a problem so complex and deep. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. The rooms that were once filled with Robert's booming laughter and the smell of my Sunday roasts now felt cavernous and cold. My memories, once a source of infinite comfort, now felt like ghosts haunting the hallways, whispering of a happier time that Brenda was methodically trying to erase. I would sit in Robert's big leather armchair, running my hand over the worn arms, and promise us, that I wouldn't let her destroy what we had built. This house was my fortress, the last bastion of my life with him, and I would not surrender it. A few nights later, I was woken by a sound from upstairs. It was faint at first, a soft, rhythmic thumping. It wasn't the usual groaning of an old house settling. It was something else. I strained my ears, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It sounded like someone crying, a muffled, heartbroken sob, punctuated by the soft thud of a fist hitting a pillow. It went on for several minutes before fading into an unnerving silence. I lay awake for hours, staring at the shifting shadows on the ceiling, the sound echoing in my mind. The next morning, Brenda's eyes were puffy and red, but her expression was as hard and unyielding as granite. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place a week later. I was looking for a spare blanket in the hall closet when my hand brushed against something hidden behind a stack of old towels. A small, leather-bound photo album. It wasn't mine. My curiosity overpowering my sense of propriety, I opened it. The pictures were of a woman I'd never seen before, an older woman with kind, tired eyes and a smile that looked vaguely, unsettlingly familiar. In some of the older, faded pictures, she was with a much younger Brenda, a teenager with a bright, genuine smile I hadn't seen in years. Her mother. On the last page, a recent photo was tucked into the plastic sleeve. It was the same woman, Agnes, but she looked frail and thin, her smile gone, a lost and confused expression on her face. Below it, a handwritten note in Brenda's script. "Mom, I promise I will find a way. I won't let you down." So, Agnes Miller was her mother. A jolt went through me, but it didn't change anything. In fact, it only made it worse. She was diverting family funds to her own mother while treating me, her husband's mother, like a prisoner in my own home. My mind raced, constructing the narrative. Perhaps her plan was to move her mother in once I was out of the way. The sheer, cold-blooded audacity of it stole my breath. I became more daring, fueled by a righteous fury. I knew there was one place I hadn't looked: the attic. The door at the end of the upstairs hallway was always kept locked. Brenda had said years ago it was because of drafts and dust, that there was nothing up there but old junk and forgotten Christmas decorations. I had never had a reason to doubt her before. Now, I saw that locked door as the final piece of the mystery. What was she hiding up there? One Thursday, Mark had a late board meeting and Brenda announced she was going to the grocery store. It was my chance. My heart thudded in my chest as I went to the junk drawer in the kitchen. I remembered seeing a small, antique brass key in there years ago. It was still there, tucked under a book of matches and some old rubber bands. My hands trembled as I climbed the stairs, my knees protesting with every agonizing step. The key slid into the lock and turned with a soft, ominous click. I pushed the door open and was met with a rush of cool, stale air. The attic was not filled with junk. It was small and cramped, but it had been converted into a makeshift room. A simple cot was made up in the corner with a worn, patchwork quilt. A small nightstand held a glass of water, a bottle of prescription pills, and a well-thumbed paperback. A portable commode stood discreetly behind a folding screen. It was sparse, almost like a prison cell, but it was clear that someone was living here. On the nightstand, next to the pills, was a framed photograph. It was the same woman from the album, Agnes Miller. My mind reeled, a whirlwind of confusion and horror. It didn't make sense. The checks to a nursing home, the ATM withdrawals nearby. And yet, here was a room. Was she moving her mother back and forth, hiding her like contraband? The deception was deeper and more complex than I could have possibly imagined. I stood there, frozen, trying to process the bleak scene. Then I heard it. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Brenda was home early. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. I quickly backed out of the room, pulling the door shut and fumbling to lock it, my heart hammering against my ribs. I practically flew down the stairs, my bad knee screaming in protest, and managed to shove the key back in the drawer just as Brenda walked in, grocery bags in her arms. "Eleanor? What are you doing in here?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion as she saw me standing, breathless, by the drawer. "I was just getting a glass of water," I lied, my voice shaking uncontrollably. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing, scanning my face. She knew. I don't know how, but in that moment of charged silence, I knew that she knew I had discovered her secret. The air between us crackled with unspoken accusations. The quiet war was about to become an all-out battle, and I knew I had to strike first. I had all the ammunition I needed. The checkbook, the nursing home, and now, the secret room in the attic. Subscribe now. You won't believe the twist that's coming. The confrontation happened 2 days later. It was a Sunday. Mark was home, trying to enjoy his one day off by reading the paper in the living room. The quiet was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over deep, dark, turbulent water. I couldn't bear it another minute. The poison had to come out. I walked into the kitchen where Brenda was scrubbing a pot with a furious, frantic energy. I placed the checkbook register on the counter beside her, the small booklet landing with a sound like a gavel. "I think you have some explaining to do," I said, my voice low and steady, radiating a cold authority I hadn't felt in years. She froze, her knuckles white as she gripped the sponge. She didn't turn around. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," I pressed on, my anger making me bold, almost giddy. "Agnes Miller. Oakwood Nursing Facility. Or should I talk about the little bedroom you've set up in my attic?" She dropped the sponge into the soapy water with a splash. Slowly, she turned to face me. The mask was gone. Her face was a canvas of raw exhaustion and profound despair. Tears welled in her eyes, but her jaw was set in a line of defiance. "You went into my things?" "You went into the attic?" "I went into the attic of my house." I shot back, my voice rising. "The one you seem to think of as your personal boarding house and bank." Mark appeared in the doorway, the newspaper crumpled in his fist, his face a landscape of confusion. "What's going on?" "Mom? Brenda?" This was my moment. I turned to my son, my voice ringing with righteous indignation, the words I had been rehearsing pouring out. "Your wife has been lying to us, Mark. She's been stealing from us, sending hundreds of dollars every month to her mother, all while planning to put me in a home so she can move her own family in. She has a secret room set up in the attic, Mark. A secret life." Mark looked at Brenda, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Brenda? Is this true? What is she talking about?" Brenda just stared at me, a single tear tracing a path through the weariness on her cheek. She looked utterly, completely defeated. "It's not what you think," she whispered, her voice a thread. "Isn't it?" I sneered, the bitterness I'd been swallowing for months pouring out of me like bile. "I heard you, that day in the kitchen. I can't stand taking care of this old woman. That's what you said. You were talking about me. You resent me. You want me gone. You think you can just take over my life, my home, everything my husband and I worked for?" I took a step closer to her, my entire body trembling with rage and a strange, painful sense of victory. I was finally exposing her for the manipulative, cruel woman she was. You seem to have forgotten something very important, Brenda. You live here under my roof. You eat my food. This is my house. I built it with my husband. Every nail, every floorboard is a part of me. I paused, letting the weight of my next words fill the suffocating silence of the room. I looked her dead in the eye and delivered the final, devastating blow. So let me remind you who the owner of this house is. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. Mark looked horrified, speechless. Brenda didn't flinch. She just closed her eyes, and another tear fell, then another. She let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, a sound of complete and utter brokenness that chilled me to the bone. When she opened her eyes again, there was no fight left in them. Only a vast, empty sadness. You're right, Eleanor, she said, her voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. You're right about everything. Except for one thing. She took a shaky breath, her gaze unwavering. When I said I couldn't stand taking care of that old woman, I wasn't talking about you. My world tilted on its axis. The words didn't compute, a language I couldn't understand. What? What are you talking about? Of course you were. Who else could you have been talking about? No, she said, shaking her head as tears streamed freely down her face. Mark stepped forward, placing a hand on her arm, but she shrugged it off. She needed to say this herself. The room in the attic, it's for my mother. Agnes, she's up there right now. I stared at her, my mind refusing to accept it, scrambling to hold on to the neat, simple narrative of my own victimhood. But the nursing home? The money? My father, Brenda said, her voice cracking, when he died 2 years ago, he didn't leave her with anything. He left her with debt. A mountain of it. We lost their house. She has dementia, Eleanor. Alzheimer's. It started a few years ago, but it's getting worse. She wanders. She gets confused. She can't be left alone. The checks to Oakwood weren't for a room there. I could never afford that. It's an adult daycare facility. A place I can take her a few days a week so I can work, for the few hours I can scrape together the money for. The rest of the time, she's here, in the attic. The kitchen seemed to shrink around me. The air grew thin. Every piece of evidence I had so painstakingly collected rearranged itself in my mind, forming a new, horrifying picture. The exhaustion. The secretive calls, pleading with the daycare for more time or a later payment. The crying I'd heard in the night. The food I thought she was sneaking away for herself, which was really a tray for her mother. I was bringing her a tray that day, Brenda continued, her voice hollow and dead. I was so tired. She had a bad night. She didn't know who I was. She hit me. She was scared. And I was talking to myself, Eleanor, out loud, on the verge of breaking. I said, I can't stand taking care of this old woman. I was talking about my own mother. And I hate myself for it every single day. My carefully constructed fortress of anger and self-pity crumbled into dust. The righteousness that had fueled me for months evaporated, leaving behind a sickening, ice-cold shame that settled deep in my stomach. I looked at this woman, my daughter-in-law, and for the first time, I truly saw her. I saw the crushing weight she had been carrying, alone, too proud or too scared to ask for help. She wasn't a villain plotting my demise. She was a daughter, trying desperately to care for her ailing mother in the only way she knew how, terrified of losing the roof over all our heads. My museum, my fortress. While I was polishing my grievances and nursing my wounded pride, she was engaged in a real, desperate, heartbreaking war. And I, in my pride and my pain, had been her enemy. The final piece clicked into place with a nauseating thud. The reason for her resentment. It wasn't about me being a burden. It was because, from her perspective, I had everything she and her mother had lost. A secure home, financial stability, a sound mind. Her bitterness wasn't directed at me personally, but at the brutal, random unfairness of it all. And my complaints, my suspicions, my constant, silent demands for attention must have felt like daggers to a woman already bleeding out. Why? I whispered, the single word a plea for understanding. For a way back from the horrible place I had taken us. Why didn't you just tell us? Brenda finally looked at Mark, her eyes pleading for him to understand. I was ashamed, she said, her voice breaking completely. I was so ashamed. We were barely making ends meet as it was. How could I ask you to take on my mother, too? In your mother's house? I was terrified you would say no. That you'd tell me to put her in a state facility. I couldn't do that to her, Mark. I promised her I wouldn't. So I hid her. I thought I could handle it. But I'm not handling it. I'm failing. She collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with convulsive, gut-wrenching sobs. Mark rushed to her side, wrapping his arms around her, his own face pale with shock and guilt. He hadn't known either. He was as blind as I had been. And I just stood there, rooted to the spot, the owner of the house. The owner of a home where a woman had been secretly, desperately suffering. My angry words echoed in the silence, cruel and monstrous. Let me remind you who the owner of this house is. I had meant it as a weapon to assert my power. Now, it just felt like my own epitaph. The epitaph of a proud, foolish, and terribly cruel old woman. The moments after Brenda's confession were a blur of shame and quiet movement. Mark helped a still sobbing Brenda up to their room. I was left alone in the kitchen, the silence now a deafening accusation. I sank into a chair, my body feeling every one of its 82 years. I had been so wrong, so profoundly, devastatingly wrong. My self-pity had been a poison, a cataract over my eyes, blinding me to someone else's very real agony. After a long time, I pushed myself up from the table. My legs were stiff, but my purpose was clear. I climbed the stairs again, each step an act of penance. This time, I didn't use a key. I knocked softly on the attic door. Brenda? A frail voice called from within. Is that you, dear? I think I need my pills. My heart ached. I cleared my throat, which felt thick with unshed tears. It's Eleanor, I said, my voice gentle, almost a whisper. May I come in? There was a pause, then the sound of shuffling feet. The lock clicked, and the door opened a crack. A woman with frightened, cloudy blue eyes peered out at me. It was Agnes. She was small and bird-like, wrapped in a thick cardigan despite the warmth of the house. She looked at me, her brow furrowed in confusion. Do I know you? She asked, her voice thin and reedy. I'm Eleanor, I said again, offering her a small, trembling smile. I live here. This is my home. The words tasted different now. Not a claim of ownership, but a statement of fact, an offering, and I think, I added, my voice catching, it's your home now, too. Her confusion didn't fade, but the fear in her eyes lessened slightly. I gently pushed the door open wider. It's a bit chilly up here, I said, looking at the sparse, sad room. I have a much warmer room downstairs. It gets the morning sun. I think you'd like it very much. Later that evening, the three of us, me, Mark, and a red-eyed but composed Brenda, sat around the kitchen table. The war was over. The air was cleared, leaving behind a fragile, tender quiet. Agnes was settled in the guest room downstairs, fast asleep, tucked into a bed with my best linens and a hot water bottle for her feet. I am so sorry, I said, the words feeling pitifully, laughably inadequate. Brenda, I was cruel. There's no other word for it. I was so wrapped up in my own pride and my own hurt, I couldn't see anything else. Brenda reached across the table and, to my surprise, took my hand. Her hand was rough and callous, the hand of a woman who worked too hard at too many things. I'm sorry, too, Eleanor, she said, her voice soft. I should have told you. I should have trusted you. I let my fear and my pride get in the way. I was resentful and I took it out on you. It wasn't fair. Mark sat between us, placing his hands over our joined ones. We're a family, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We're supposed to carry these things together. And in that moment, in the warmth of the kitchen where so much silent poison had been brewed, we finally were. The secrets and suspicions that had turned my house into a cold museum were gone. In their place, a difficult, painful truth had emerged, but a truth we could face together. The house no longer felt like my fortress to be defended. It felt like a home again, a sanctuary, not just for me, but for all of us. For two old women who needed care, and for the children who loved them. caught between the past and the future. The weight hadn't disappeared, but now it was shared. And a shared weight, I was finally, humbly learning, is a burden that can be borne. Comment which part of the story left you speechless.